school, my first interaction with art outside of looking at it in textbooks and reading about it online was going to small galleries throughout town where I lived and going to the permanent collection at the Detroit Institute of Art. And in these early experiences, in conjunction with the art classes I was taking, I learned how to look at objects one at a time and carefully deconstruct them based on the elements of art and the principles of design, circling around a space looking at each work in isolation. That all changed my senior year of high school when I went to the reopening of the Cranbrook Art Museum in my hometown. And here I looked at exhibits in a very different way. The exhibit, aptly titled "No Object is an Island," placed works of art in conversation with one another in a way I had never seen before. As a viewer in this space, I couldn't help but look at two objects and craft a connection between them. One of my fondest memories is standing between the sculpture by Tony Martelli that was this hyperrealistic sculpture of a man crouching down. And right next to it were these two taxidermied rams with faces like female humans by Kate Clark. And as I was in this space, I was moved. I couldn't look at one object at a time and ignore the other. There was an inherent narrative that was present between the two. The process of looking at art in museums changed for me. It was no longer looking at one thing at a time, but rather creating this network in that space. So based on this experience, I knew I wanted to put together exhibits. I wanted someone to walk into a space and have that aha moment that I did, where these works of art came together in such a beautiful way and I learned something from it. I applied to Duke for that very reason. Nasher provides this unbelievable collaborative environment where we can work together and bring works together, and as a student, I can actually curate a show. And I was very fortunate to have been accepted here because within moments of being on campus, first semester my freshman year, I was already curating. I took a class taught by Professor Anne-Marie Rasmussen titled Rivalrous Masculinities. And I didn't know anything about masculinity. I didn't know anything about German or medieval and Renaissance studies in which this course was cross-listed. But what I did know is that after combing through all the classes available on ACES, this one allowed me to do a final project where I would curate a show at Nasher. So I enrolled in this course, and what was very interesting is the group of people that it brought together. We had people studying women's studies, art history, psychology, and English, and so on. And what happens when you bring together people with different viewpoints is that they bring very different things that they think are important about masculinity with them. And so one of the major problems that we faced is how do we bring together works of art that would construct a story about masculinity and that we could agree on this one narrative. We had to construct something into this visual essay. One of the benefits of this course was actually we had an international collaboration with Humboldt University and the University of Bamberg in Germany. We would video conference with them, and their courses would look at masculinity through literature, and we would study it through art. And during one of our video conferencing sessions, we brought to them this dilemma that we faced. How do we weave these works together? And then one of their instructors said, "Have you thought about vulnerability?" Because they had read about it. And he was seeing these little glimmers of vulnerability in the paintings and the works that we had presented to him. In that moment, this light bulb kind of went off, and we reframed the works on our shortlist to look at them through this lens of vulnerability. And vulnerability and masculinity are two things you really don't consider going together, but with this outside input, we kind of changed the way we looked. Then it made sense to have Kehinde Wiley's Ivla III staring directly across at Francois Girard's painting here. They both had this central masculine figure that was very characteristic of their times. But then there were these glimmers of vulnerability that were present, and with that you could stand between these two works, one on one side, one on the other, and kind of craft that narrative and learn something from that. One of the most fulfilling aspects of this work and of this exhibit and the course in general was that we were able to see how viewers reacted to the works. As student curators, we're not only students learning about these really complex ideas of the social construction of gender and how masculinity is actually plural and masculinities, but we also have to act as teachers. We teach the people who walk into this space. And many of the visitors don't, and actually all of the visitors, they don't sit through class with us for a semester and do all the readings that we've done. So how would we teach them about these intricacies of masculinity? And so that's what we had to think about, how these works connect together. And this was one of my favorite aspects, is this interactive portion that we had where visitors could walk through the space, and at the end they could define a man. And with that, we could see, had their initial assumptions changed? Had they learned something new? Did we do our job? So with these experiences, I learned how to think in museums. I learned how to think at the Nasher. Everything isn't compartmentalized, but rather we create this series of networks. We connect works together. And when you not only have this chance to look again, but you have to look at something differently. From there, I was ready to get back into curating once more, and I was very fortunate to be part of this amazing Bass Connections group called Art, Vision, and the Brain. And we were tasked with this idea of putting together this exhibit that would be held at the Nasher, as well as organizing a symposium with the Duke Institute of Brain Sciences, bringing together neuroscientists and artists to discuss these topics of color and brightness. This project held a great deal of personal value for me because this is something I pursue in my personal research, kind of bringing together the art and the science, but it also taught me how to look in an unbelievably extraordinary way. I want you to consider the makeup of our team. In terms of our undergrads, we had a neuroscience major and a biomedical engineering major, as well as myself. And our project leaders were made up of an art historian, a neuroscientist, an ophthalmologist, and an engineer, as well as a neuroscience postdoc. We all brought these very different ways of seeing. When we would look at a painting based on our backgrounds, we could point out very different things. Collectively, though, we learned how to look. We spent time at the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Ackland Museum at UNC. We talked to artists Bill Noland and M.J. Sharp. We even spent time making our own works of art, learning black and white photography, and doing the exercises that Joseph Albers writes about in his text, Interactions of Color. And we can't forget these endless hours that we spent at the Nasher, looking at the works that are present on the walls, but also combing through everything that was in storage and discussing them, expressing what we saw and listening to each other. We also learned how to look differently, quantitatively. We took measurements and we examined color not just by looking at it and describing a painting, but non-invasively experimenting on it by using a spectroradiometer. The real conversations happened when we discussed what we saw. One of our first tasks was to go through the exhibit and look at everything, go through all the exhibits that were up at the Nasher and look at everything that was present, and we came across Odita's Over Here, Over There. Now, as someone with an art and art history background, I could point out certain things, warm and cool colors, but then Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, who has a neuroscience background, asks us, why does the blue appear to float? Now, I hadn't been asked this before, I never considered it. And then in that moment, we had this lesson about how blue is processed by our visual system. And this was really interesting because you're bringing together these two very different ways of discussing art. And it launched this new way of discussing things in general. And we looked not as just an art historian, not just as a neuroscientist, but together. And here we are looking through the Joseph Albers portfolio with Dr. Robert Chapley, who visited us from NYU. He's a neuroscientist there. And we had these amazing discussions about different visual phenomena that we saw. We could look at Fellrath-Hines' Yellow on Yellow, and we could discuss color induction. Anna Skavitz's prints brought about conversations on equiluminance. We could talk about color, and we could talk about form, but we could also discuss visual phenomena like the Chevreul effect. And the more and more that we discussed, the more this turned into a collaboration. We could talk about the art and we could talk about the science, but these two fields became seamless in our discussions because we listened to how others looked. This is only possible in adopting new eyes, willingly being able to reframe a work of art. Marcel Proust alludes to this in his text In Search of Lost Time in Volume 5, where he has this quote, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." Now, this is actually used on a lot of travel websites, and a lot of travel bloggers will post it on their web pages, but the quote, a little longer and translated by C.K. Moncrief, talks about this idea of being able to behold the universe through the eyes of another, and the quote is actually in reference to Proust's discussion about a composer, and in a broader sense, artists. I learned to think in museums, and I learned to think at the Nasher because I was willing to behold the art through the eyes of another. These processes of not just curation, but looking at art in general, has to do with this level of reframing. It allows you to make connections, to construct this network, craft an intricate narrative, or discuss and spark conversations about these really robust ideas that you may have not considered before. This process of looking and this process of learning becomes so much more beautiful the more you look. And it becomes something much more layered and something much more complex because more disciplines become involved, you hear more voices. It's these interactions and collaborations that make interdisciplinary work so worth doing. As a student, I can tell you there's a huge difference between taking classes in a bunch of different fields versus actually forcing them into conversation with one another. And with more and more practice and more engagement as the Nasher allows, this becomes less and less like this forced conversation and more like a natural flow of information between people. The only true voyage of discovery, as Proust says, is this way that you can learn new things time and time again, that you can add to the knowledge that's out there. It's not just in looking again, but it's in looking differently and seeing with new eyes. Thank you.